Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Jess Galaxy and I am really excited to actually talk about the craft of writing for the first time on this channel. It's something that I have planned on doing since like the start of this channel. Well, not from the start, but after I transitioned this channel to more of a writing like essay channel, I was like, oh, I should talk about like writing. And then I was like, I shouldn't do that. I'm not a published author, but now I am a published author. And also that was the imposter syndrome in the first place because like I've always been a decent writer, so I always probably could have spoken to this. Anyway, so that aside, I'm talking about fight scenes today. The reason for that is because I love writing them. Also, please bear with me. I am gonna have the laptop for this one. I need it. There's notes. There's notes. They're important. Just to give you guys a quick rundown, I am going to talk a lot about like violence in general, but I'm not going to get into like anything super specific. I'm also not going to like get into anything specifically very gory or anything like that. Just wanted to give you a heads up really quick before I got into this, but we are going to be talking about like using weapons and things like that. So to start, my credentials. This is not just an excuse to hold up my books. So not only have I recently published 2 kind of like adventure fantasy books, cozy adventure fantasy, adventure, cozy books. So not only that, I have actually been very often told that I tend to write very dynamic and very interesting fight scenes, not just by my editor, but by other people. And then also like people who have like reviewed my books have mentioned that. And then also in general, just it's something that's come up. It was also like, even like when I was writing in college for like my college classes, whenever I wrote a fight scene. So there's all of that where people are literally just telling me I'm good at it. Also on top of that, I have literal fighting experience, which I think is part of the reason why I tend to get told that I write these things very well. I think having firsthand experience with things can be, in general, very, very helpful. And when I say I have firsthand fighting experience, I have hand-to-hand combat experience in an environment that is safe. Obviously, I was never like a street fighter or anything like that, but I did karate for years and years and years when I was a kid. I started, I think, when I was in 6th grade. I think I only really stopped when I was a senior in high school. Well, actually, no, it was really more that I stopped when I was a freshman in college. The only reason I really stopped was because I went to school and I didn't really have the time anymore to keep doing it. So even to this day, when I like do things like I exercise and stuff like that, I still shadow box, I still do kata and things like that, because I think it is a very holistic way to keep yourself healthy, especially if you're not literally fighting people and breaking your fingers all the time or your toes all the time, like I was constantly. So let's talk about the basics of writing a good fight scene. The first thing you need to understand is like where realism falls in your particular book. And so I've made this handy dandy scale. This is kind of how I think of fighting realism. Like what this tends to be is there's 2 ends to this spectrum. It is a spectrum. There's the slow end and there is the fast end. The middle is the most realistic, and as you move in either direction, it gets more and more unrealistic. Back up a little bit. Let's go over the scale. All the way to the left on the unrealistic slow side, you have like C-list 80s kung fu movies, homemade dojo videos and things like that, where it's very staged. It's very obvious that it's like not real, but they're trying to make it look very powerful and damaging. You also in this situation see a lot of combination of fighting with acrobatics, where they're doing acrobatics that make no sense and have nothing to do with fighting. This is kind of where you see a lot of those, like a slow version of a lot of very unrealistic fighting techniques. So like drop kicking someone or grabbing their like shoulder and pinching their nerves and things like that. Like a lot of those things that are a little bit unrealistic, more not necessarily that they aren't real, but they are things that aren't particularly helpful in a fight necessarily. You'll see a lot of that going on because it kind of like looks cool. You'll also see like a slightly faster version of this. So like obviously this is the slowest end of the spectrum, but if even when they are moving a little bit fast, a lot of times they're doing very safe techniques, or they're purposefully like trying to angle the camera so that you can't tell that they're not like actually hitting each other. So next you'll see on the slow scale is like medieval times, at least my local medieval times. Before anyone judges me, I've only ever been to one medieval times, and it is the one outside of Chicagoland. And so the reason that I say this is because it's faster than like what you would see in some of these like older kung fu movies, but you're generally not seeing them go super quick, especially with the weapons fighting. So if they're using swords or they're using like battle axes or war hammers and things like that, they move a little too slow. And then you also get a lot of the flashiness. Obviously, there's some level of like trying to create sparks, whereas like that's not something you would actively try to do with a sword in a fight normally. So yeah, I think of Medieval Times kind of right in the middle of the slow side entirely, just because honestly, it's just like what makes sense for what Medieval Times does. It is the safest way for them to do fight choreography that they can repeatedly do over and over and over again, twice a day, 365, well, not 365, but you know what I mean. And, you know, have it look fun and inviting for kids and like really cool, but also at the same time, it's very slow. They're doing these bouts and they're bouncing away from each other, and like they're not attacking each other like after they drop something and things like that. So it's just like a little bit unrealistic in that way. I would not say the same thing necessarily for Ren fairs. So if like you've never been to a Medieval Times and you're like, oh, well, maybe I can compare this to like a Ren fair. I find that at least for me in my local Ren fair, the fighting at those Ren fairs tends to be more realistic. It's more like the next level up on this scale, which is like stage fight choreography, you know, that kind of stuff, like where you're gonna see more play action. So like think of if you've ever had to watch like a Shakespeare play where there was some kind of fighting going on in school, or you've ever seen a play where they do some kind of fighting. So like for me, I always think of the fight choreography in certain stage versions of Hamlet that I've seen. For some reason, it always just like kind of reminds me of that. Granted, they're always trying to like poison each other, so like I don't know why there was a fight scene in some of the Hamlet. Maybe I'm thinking of Macbeth. I might be thinking of the wrong Shakespeare play right now, but that aside, a lot of like when you do see fight choreography in Shakespeare and other stage plays, this is really where I see that it falls. It's a little bit better than Medieval Times. It's a little bit faster, but it tends to be a little bit overdone, a little bit dramatic on purpose, because obviously in a stage environment, you have to be very careful. A lot of things could go wrong. And I would say the same thing with Medieval Times. That's why these tend to be on the slower end of things. You can't go too fast because it would literally put each other at risk. And that's not what you want when you're an actor. That's not what you want in general. With your book characters, you can put them at a lot of risk because they're not real. They're real in my heart. Okay, so now we're getting into like the realistic territory. And you might be confused because on the scale, it says pro wrestling and Ren fairs for the first side of the realistic. And that's just because I tend to find pro wrestling and Ren fairs tend to move a little bit faster and be a little bit more realistic. And particularly they tend to be over dramatic and bombastic in a way that makes a little bit more sense than what I found in kind of that slower category. The reason for that is because like obviously with pro wrestling, they're putting on a certain amount of show, like they're yelling at the crowd and stuff like that. So it kind of makes sense when they like have a bout and then they walk away from each other to like yell at the crowd. It just seems to make a little bit more sense to me. I don't know why. Maybe this is just me. And then I go to the Bristol Renaissance Fair every year. I feel like I should preface that. I do know that it is rated one of the best in the country. So that might be part of the reason that I think of the Ren Fair as being a little bit better than something like Medieval Times. But they tend to do shows where there's fight choreography, there's staging, but it makes a lot more sense. So they're in a ring, they're kind of coming at each other, they're doing bouts, they're bouncing away, they're taking a moment to breathe, and then they're attacking each other again, or even sometimes they are following each other even after someone has fallen or, fallen and things like that, which is something you're gonna see more in a realistic fight, because in reality, people fall over, people get hurt and stuff like that in a fight, and then people continue to attack them, because a lot of times when you are writing a fight scene for especially like a fantasy series, they are fighting with malicious intent. They are trying to kill your main character, or your main character is trying to kill somebody else. And so because of that, that's where you kind of see that connection to the Ren Fair in that. And I think some of this too might be that, with the Ren Fair, they have like this kind of seasonal thing where they have the time to take care of their armor in between and things like that, as opposed to Medieval Times, which is going every single day basically. So, they don't have to worry about damaging their armor with the Ren Fair as much, perhaps, as Medieval Time. And also sometimes with Medieval Times, I don't think they're even really wearing full like metal armor. I think some of it is fake, which might be also part of the reason. But yeah, so that's really why that's there. Pro wrestling obviously is very fake, but at the same time, they tend to move pretty fast. Those movements are more like acrobatic grabs and aerials and things like that, which come across a lot more real. And then from here, this is where we get into the most realistic, which is things like professional MMA fighting, professional karate tournaments, Olympic judo, Olympic wrestling, boxing. All of these are obviously realistic because they are real fights in a controlled environment. And the reason I'm using this instead of like street fighting is because personally, I don't think we should condone people going around and fighting each other or watching videos of people actually assaulting each other as like research. Though I do understand that like sometimes you're looking for that realism. I think especially if you're like a fantasy writer, you don't necessarily need to look for that level of realism, especially because most of the time people are not trained combatants in real life, but in a fantasy novel, your characters are probably somewhat of a trained combatant, which is why I think these are better examples than like watching like news footage of people getting into fights and things like that. So yeah, I would highly recommend if you're like really interested in learning more about fighting. I don't really love MMA as like an example for a dynamic fight scene just because I think there's a lot of grappling in it. I would say the same thing about Olympic wrestling. It's just so much grappling, it doesn't like look great, but if you want to write a scene where like the characters are grappling each other, those are really good examples of what you could be doing. Judo I think is really fun to watch for like thinking about how you're going to write a fight scene entirely because it's really dynamic. There's a lot of throwing each other around, there's a lot of knocking each other over and things like that. I would say also kendo as well can be really fun to watch. It's another really good example to watch for if you're interested in talking about swordsmanship, though it is an Eastern style of swordsmanship, so just like keep that in mind. So then from here, this is where you kind of get into, okay, so we're still in the realistic space, but this is where we start to move towards the unrealistic end, where they're being very fast as opposed to being very slow. So that was what the left side was, the right side is about speed, all about fast. A lot of this is about speed, you'll find, because that is a lot of making fight scenes makes sense, especially visual fight scenes. So the next level up from this, from like realistic fighting, is like 80s, 90s martial arts movies. 80s, 90s like Jackie Chan movies, but 80s, 90s like Bruce Lee, Sonny Chiba, those sorts of films. But the reason I bring these up in particular is like the Karate Kid, you know, Mr. Miyagi, like those kind of guys. When you see them fighting in these movies, a lot of times they are trying to replicate a true competition environment, at least with the Karate Kid especially. And because of that, they are a little bit more realistic. They still would often move faster. You do very often find that they have actually sped the fight scenes up a little bit in this situation, mostly because like Ralph Macchio was not a trained fighter when he was an actor. Whereas like Bruce Lee films and Sonny Chiba films, it's like these are trained fighters that are now acting. So you can kind of see that difference a little bit there. So there's even like a scale within this scale. But you know, like Bruce Lee movies, like he's very often doing those like really quick bouts that are really realistic, but his hits are very often, the movie frames them as being equally powered. That is where the unrealistic effort kind of comes in. Usually when you see a hit in a real fight, it'll be like all different powers. You know, if you're bub, if that's like your combo, like a jab, hook. When you're doing that sort of combo, that jab is not going to be nearly as powerful as your hook. Usually your hook is your dominant hand, which is usually going to be a little bit stronger in a fight. And then on top of that, like this is usually something that you do to kind of get their guard up here so that you can give them a hook because you're aiming for the ribs. You want them to pick their arms up. And so that's kind of where that's at. Moving on from there, we're going to talk about Jackie Chan movies. 80s, 90s Jackie Chan movies are a really good example of a realistic, fast-paced fight scene. They're incredibly dynamic. They're super fun to watch. I personally love the Rush Hour movies. I always have. And because they're a comedy, like they're trying to do some silly things. Like he's doing barrel rolls. He's like, his hands are duct taped together. So he's like grabbing people with his thighs and stuff like that. And it's really fun. And I think they're a really good example if you want to write a dynamic fight scene, is trying to like look at those scenes. Because honestly, I think there's no one who really does it better than Jackie Chan. The other piece of media that I will say is anything with Michelle Yeoh. She's an incredibly good martial artist, but I'm particularly thinking of Everything Everywhere All at Once. That was such a good example of like 80s, 90s, like really fast-paced, dynamic, almost comical fight scenes. And obviously there's some like even wilder stuff happening there where there are like the people who have hot dog hands all of a sudden and things like that. You know, these scenes they're more unrealistic than those other 80s, 90s martial arts movies I mentioned, because one, they're faster, and two, they have endurance that no one else in the world would have. They just keep fighting. Those fight scenes are 10 minutes long and they're still going and they're still fine. A lot of times they're not even getting knocked over or they're not even getting winded. And the reason for that is because they're cutting and they're doing different scenes and different shots, and like then they edit it all together with movie magic. And so, you know, with those fight scenes, they go on and on and on, whereas in reality, if you are moving that fast and hitting people that hard, you are not going to be able to do it for that long. And so that's kind of why I would say this is a more unrealistic representation than something like the Karate Kid is. Now, going on from there, I had a really hard time with this section because this middle fast section, it's like not easy to pin down, mostly because like when you start watching like something like Rush Hour is like a comedy, so there's a certain speed level that comes with it that is a little bit different than what I'm talking about in this situation. So I think the best example I have is the Robert Downey Jr. Sherlock Holmes. There's a very famous scene in there where he like sits there and calculates everything he wants to do to this guy, and it shows him like doing it in like under a second, and it's like 8 or 9 different moves. And like, yeah, there are combinations you can do that fast, but they're not the combinations that he's doing, you know, because he like jabs him and then hooks him, and then at one point comes in and smacks his ears with his hand, like both of his hands. He gets him like this, and it's like a lot of those big large movements that look really cool on screen, they're just not realistic when it comes down to it. So there's like a couple of things here. He drops his guard so much in that scene, and that's like indicative of it being a really fast fight scene. He drops his guard so much in that scene that it's just like it's incredibly unrealistic. That other guy was a trained boxer. He probably would have hit him in the face like 4 times. And obviously he's like disorienting him and stuff like that. And this level of like being able to move like pow, 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 especially with these fairly powerful attacks in quick succession that aren't necessarily part of a combo either, because like he is doing some combos where he'll like jab and then hook, but then he'll also like do, like I said, the thing with like his ears, like part of a combo, and is not going to be a fast movement. And so because of that, while this fight is fast, it is like unrealistically fast is what I'm getting at. And then from here we move on to the very, very opposite end of the spectrum from where we started, which is like shonen anime, Naruto, One Piece, Jujutsu Kaisen, Dragon Ball Z. All of these things move so unrealistically fast. Like very famously, Dragon Ball Z, like they're not even necessarily animating the fight all of the time. They're showing like some kind of representation of them like hitting each other twice, and then it like has some like action lines, and then they move over here. And so obviously like that's not realistic. And then, you know, with like One Piece, like there's people who stretch and things like that are going on, and you know, Zoro has a sword in his mouth. But like all of those things are kind of playing into that very classic like really fast samurai aesthetic, where you very famously see like there's like a flash of light, and then they're on the other side of the person, and the person slowly falls apart because they have been cut in half. Those things are not realistic for obvious reasons, but you know, like what makes them unrealistic? It's the speed. It's the fact that they're doing weird combination moves that don't really make a lot of sense. You know, and I'm not just talking about like them blasting like energy at each other, like Kamehameha and things like that. I'm talking about like just repeatedly hitting people in the face, which doesn't make a lot of sense. It's not going to bode well for you. You will probably break your knuckles doing that. Skulls are hard. You don't want to hit someone in the skull. You want to hit them in the ribs. Sorry, Goku, you're not doing it right. Don't know how to fight. And Naruto is another really good example of this, in which they're like, you know, they're throwing things at each other. They'll like go from like throwing something at someone to suddenly being like in their face and like coming down on them with like a haymaker, which doesn't really make a lot of sense in a lot of situations. You wouldn't jump to punch someone. You wouldn't jump to kick someone really either, even though people really like to drop kick people in movies. That's not the thing. Anyway, I've been yapping a lot about the scale. Let's move on. So obviously, speed is incredibly important. Another thing that you really need to keep in your mind is when people fight each other, they're going to become wounded, not just from getting hit, but from hitting the other person. Your hands start to hurt. Your hands can start to bleed. Your feet will hurt. You'll catch your toes. You'll break your fingers. You'll break your toes. You'll maybe shatter your shin if you hit someone wrong. And you know, that's one of those things that when it comes down to it, a lot of times people ignore that. There is a level of like, oh, I am so filled with adrenaline that I am not thinking about the fact that I am hurt. But at the same time, if you're like writing a more realistic fight scene and you want to hit that more realistic level, you have to keep that in mind. If someone is throwing elbows, their elbow is going to start hurt. They're not going to be able to do that over and over and over again at the same speed. You know, their hands are going to hurt from holding their sword. Their hands are going to hurt from hitting people. Their hands are going to hurt from guarding their face so that they don't get hit in the face and things like that. So that's all something you have to keep in mind. And they're going to get wounded. They're going to get wounded fast. On top of that, fatal wounds. Personally, I don't think it's so bad if someone has a very obviously fatal wound and they still manage to like hit someone one last time or something like that. I don't think that's bad. But something to keep in mind is if someone gets a really rough wound, it's more than likely they're not going to be able to get back up. So if they get stabbed in the stomach and the dagger comes out, they're on their knees. Like that's pretty much it when it comes down to it, especially in a fantasy setting. Unless there's some kind of magic that can heal them, they're probably not going to be doing hurting much more. Same with if they take like a cut to the throat or they get stabbed somewhere in the chest, like they've broken their chest plate, things like that. It's not gonna go well for them and they're not gonna have a lot of time. At most, you're gonna have a couple of seconds for them to do something. Another thing to keep in mind, people talk so much in fight scenes in books and things like that. That's very unrealistic. They would not be talking during the actual like hitting each other process. They would be talking in between. So now the next thing I want to talk about is kind of choosing the right level on your scale for your project. So obviously there is no right answer about this scale. You can kind of do what you want. It's more about understanding the scale and like how to use that scale to your advantage to make your fight scenes make sense for your book and then also make sense for the level of realism you're going for. This also allows you to find better examples. So like obviously I've listed some examples on this scale if you can kind of find comparative examples and things like that. So like if you're going for like a slightly fast dynamic fight scene that's a little bit unrealistic, I would highly suggest like Jackie Chan movies is a really good place to start for examples. If you're looking for something a little bit more realistic, you're going to want to look at something more like professional karate competitions or maybe MMA fighting. Personally, Olympic judo, again, judo is very fun to watch. So my point here is that no matter what, when it comes down to the speed that you want, what you're going to want to avoid is accidentally hitting that too slow to where it feels too rhythmic. That's going to make it feel not like a realistic fight. And if you're trying to avoid that really kind of campy side of the fight, like the very anime camp, high levels of camp, like Japanese like action movies, if you want to avoid that, you might want to pick something closer to the middle of the scale. Again, unless you want the camp. And so once you kind of found yourself on that scale, it comes down to actually writing these fight scenes. So something that you can really do to make it better is just watching fight scenes in movies and other media. Something that you need to understand when you're talking melee, hand-to-hand, and melee weapons, so like swords, things like that, not like guns. If you hadn't picked up on this, I'm not really talking about gunfights. So when you're talking about these kind of melee fights are broken up into kind of like moments of like bouts and then rest. I think of them as bouts, I don't know why, but it's like a bout is when they're literally coming together and clashing, so they're hitting their swords against each other, they're hitting each other in the face. All of that stuff is a bout, and that bout is going to be very short. It's going to be anywhere between, at most, it's going to be 20 seconds long, and that's long, very long. To give you some context, when I got my black belt, one of the things that we did 15 1-minute free fights, and that is a grueling experience. It is hard. You are doing your best, but by the 10th, 11th fight, you are moving much slower. So even in the first couple of fights, you have to keep in mind that you are trying to conserve your energy. Your endurance is really important in a fight. So a trained combatant is going to understand that. They're not going to be going for bouts more than like 5 or 10 seconds long because it will deplete all of their energy. And if they are in a war setting or there are other enemy combatants around, they should be thinking about the fact that they are going to have to keep fighting. Now, those break moments, those are going to be those moments where you see them panting, talking, trying to pick up a weapon. And so this is like where I kind of start to, in my head, break them up into kind of like the major actions versus the minor actions of a fight. So major actions tend to be like literal hits versus someone picking up a weapon. That's a minor action that can happen in a fight. And this is what's going to help you become more dynamic in the way you're writing these descriptions, is you want to mix these two things together. So you want to make sure that it's not like a really long bout that feels like it's going on for like minutes and minutes and minutes, and then it stops, and then they maybe pick something up or talk a little bit, and then it goes back to another minutes and minutes and minutes long fight. For me, I think there's a lot of ways you can do this to make it a little bit more dynamic, and that's by breaking up these major and minor actions. Someone might punch and then turn, and that turns a minor action, and it's really important because it allows them to take a moment to breathe before they swing around and try and kick the person. Those sort of minor actions too can also be really important in a fight, just like literally from a fighting technique standpoint. Taking a step forward and being able to get your dominant leg behind you in a spot where you can kick with your dominant leg can be really important, especially when you're pushing them back as you're doing it. If they're backing up away from you, that gives you an advantage in the fight. And so when you're thinking about these things, these minor actions, if you're trying to write a trained fighter, these minor actions are going to be just as important as these major actions. This is actually something that the Witcher books does pretty well if you're like looking for like a written example of this. Geralt is a trained fighter, and it's clear from very early on in those books, like it's clear that he's a trained fighter. He knows what he's doing. He knows how to set someone off balance. He knows how to get into their space. And the reason why you would do that is because it gives you an advantage in the fight. Now, each individual character, they're going to have their own things that give them that advantage. So for example, I'm short. So for me, being close in a fight was much more of an advantage than being further out, because I tended to be fighting people who were much taller than me. And so I was always trying to stay in close to be able to, knee people in the side. That was one of my favorite things to do. And also just, I was able to keep my guard up, and I didn't have as much arm strength, so I could easily distract them by jabbing, hitting towards their chest, but then I could pull around and roundhouse kick them in, well, a Mawashigiri isn't exactly a roundhouse kick, but it's kind of similar. But like roundhouse kick them in the ribs. Like to hit the ribs. Also, we wore pads on our hands and our legs, so like this was not doing as much damage to each other as like it would be in like a real fight where I was not wearing that sort of padding. But yeah, so basically there's a really significant part of writing a dynamic fight scene with a trained fighter where they're going to be going into this knowing that their bouts need to be short. They need to be able to move around. They need to get into the spot that's going to give them the most advantage. They use like something like a great axe to fight. They're going to want to be further away. They need that area to swing to be able to properly hit someone. And so they're going to know that. Now, when you start talking about untrained fighters, this is where it can get a little bit more complicated, but it can also get really fun. Untrained fighters are going to make the silliest mistakes. They're going to move in real close, even though they're really tall, and now suddenly they can only jab, even though they would get way more power if they had a full tilt that they could put into it and they could move their entire body into it. Obviously, that space gives them more strength. I'm just going to keep doing this as if it helps illustrate my point. They're going to make mistakes like folding their hand wrong. Instead of having their thumb in front of their fist, they're going to have it in the middle of their fist. They're going to break their fingers really easily. They're going to aim just for the face, even though that's not a really logical place to aim when you're trying to like realistically have a fight. There are other more effective places to hit people. The soft places will hurt you less and hurt them a lot more. And so they're not going to necessarily know that they need to like preserve their hands so that they're not hurting themselves. They're going to hurt their wrists. Literally any untrained fighter who fights is going to hurt their wrist in some way. If you have a character with really long nails, they're going to dig into the palm of their hand while they're trying to make a fist. It's one of those things that you have to keep all of this stuff in mind. What does your character actually look like when they are an untrained fighter? It's going to be very, very different from a trained fighter who is getting into the thick of things and is used to getting into the thick of things. And this is also going to help you break up those bouts. Someone who's an untrained fighter is going to hit, they're going to hurt their wrist, and they're going to be like, ow. They're just going to have a moment. They're going to take a moment to realize that they've hurt themselves, and they're going to be like, oh, what do I do now? And the same goes for, and like you see this a lot in Jackie Chan movies too, where they're being kind of silly with it, where like obviously he's a trained fighter, but he hits someone, he's like, ha, because it's kind of funny. That's like something that you're going to run into very often. Now, when you're talking about weapons are a little bit harder for me to speak on just because I don't have a ton of weapons training experience, and most of my weapons training experience is in Eastern style weapons, which you don't see as much in Western style fantasy. So like I know more about using a bow staff than I do using a sword. That being said, obviously there are other really great examples there of this kind of fighting. I think A Knight's Tale is a really good example of like realistic kind of medieval fighting, but probably a little bit more on that speedy side to be a little unrealistic, because A Knight's Tale is a little bit purposefully anachronistic in ways. But the thing you have to keep in mind when you're talking about melee weapons in particular is they fall out of your hand. It hurts to hold them. It's not easy to clash with a smaller weapon against a much larger, heavier weapon. A two-handed broadsword against a dagger is going to be much harder for the person with the dagger to deal with. And so if you're trying to put your characters at a disadvantage, giving them a smaller weapon is a way to do that. And I think adding weapons can make fight scenes just so interesting and just so much more dynamic in a way that can be really, really fun. Especially once you start getting into doing things like having them drop their weapons, having them switch weapons, having them decide, okay, this longsword isn't working, I'm gonna pick up an axe. Or they're doing improvised weapons, so they're grabbing like a piece of wood off the ground, or they're dealing with maybe like an iron, like when I say an iron, I mean like a little literal piece of iron that was formed into an iron that you would heat on the stove and then use to iron your clothes. I think there are really great examples of a lot of like tools that one would use on a farm that could be really great weapons, pitchforks and scythes and things like that. They're not like the first thing you would think of as, oh yeah, I'm going to use this in a fight, but they are something that you can use in a fight. And those are more improvised weapons. Another thing to keep in mind with weapons in particular is that there are a lot of things that in fantasy media are used as weapons that are not realistically going to be a very good weapon. A good example of this is actually a scythe. A scythe is not really going to be good to fight someone with for a lot of reasons. The blade faces you. It doesn't have a super strong blade, and so you're kind of better off using something like a glaive, you know, which is actually intended for fighting, even though it has a very similar style. But yeah, so this is one of those things that you're going to see in a fantasy setting that may not be realistic, but you can kind of get around it. I will say also something to keep in mind, if you have a character who's like a farmer or a blacksmith and things like that, there are certain kinds of weapons that are going to translate really well to those characters. Farmers are going to be able to take up a glaive a little bit easier because they're used to using a scythe. They're able to use a glaive in a very similar way. And I would say arguably the same thing goes for something like a blacksmith and a hammer. They're going to be able to handle a hammer very well. A really good example of this is Jace Talus Arcane, except for the fact that he's not ever good with a weapon in that series. He's like categorically one of the worst fighters in that series, despite having one of the most powerful weapons in the series, because he's just like literally bad at using it because he's not a trained combatant. I saw a breakdown on TikTok recently of someone talking about the fact that this is actually, you know what, this is a good example that I want to mention, is like when you're talking about a not trained combatant, Jace is a really good example of that in Arcane, especially in season 1. When he first goes into fights, like he's right-handed. You see him pick up things with his right hand and do things with his right hand, and yet in like early scenes where he's fighting with his hammer, he's holding it as if he's left-handed because he doesn't know what he's doing. So, you know, stuff like that is going to happen. So the last thing I want to talk about, when I've mentioned kind of breaking things up, here's the thing. When it comes to writing a fight scene, if you want a more realistic fight scene, you want that rhythm to be irregular. You want it to feel irregular to the reader. If it feels like you're using a lot of sentences that are all the same length, all the same structure, it's going to make your scene feel way less dynamic. So if it's like, Jim did this, and then Ted did this, and then Jim did this in return, that's going to make it feel almost repetitive, even if they're doing different things in each of those moments. What you want instead is you want to really vary your sentence structure and your sentence length in these scenes, because that will give you more of that feeling of that unrhythmic fight that is going on, because fights really don't necessarily have a rhythm. So that's something to keep in mind as well. And with that, I think I have talked a lot. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask me. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you enjoyed hearing me talk about this, consider subscribing to this channel. If you want to hear me talk more about writing, please let me know down below so I know that you guys like this kind of video. And then also, if you want to hear me talk even more, you can watch my video essays. I have a whole group of them up here. If you want a suggestion, perhaps watch the one about the McHanzo zine, where someone laundered a bunch of money from a zine to buy Clans merch, which is just kind of an interesting, funny thing that happened a couple of years ago in the fandom space. And yeah, thank you so much for listening, and have a great day, guys. Like I said, if you want examples of this, like homemade dojo movies are like my big thing. Like this is my dad. He's a little cowboy in this. I found this in this house. This is my grandmother's house, and I found this in my house, and I was like, I'm keeping this. Only representation of my family I'm ever gonna give you guys is this picture of my dad.